young Oscar was christened Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde. He dropped the Fingal as his boyhood romping years in a pretentious stupor. It was in 1864 when he went to the Pretorius School in Exclusion. He boarded at the academic outfit for 7 years before getting a scholarship at the Trinity College in Dublin. There's a lot more on Oscar as a youthful strumpet, really, so we shouldn't have to rely on the old imagery for a decadent canvas. Though one of his tutors said, the classics absorbed all of his attention in the latter part of his school days, and the following beauty of his oral translations in class, whether of Philocles, Plate or Virgil, was not easily to be forgotten. The fact that he hardly ever entertained or scratched up the bread bites in his college rooms, was this a hint of autistic temp he held from a teenage dotage? The college square in which his apartments squatted were dubbed Botany Bay, and they were of a squalid sort. This despite the fact that there was always a canvas and easel at the corner of said squat. He managed to get into Magdalen College in Oxford, a college that was not Cambridge. He shoved up there at 20 rather than 19, so he could have been classed as a trifle behind, but his serious nature towards academia and that ilk sort of paid off. His enthusiastic and artistic nature pushed the gimlet beyond his kin, as his specialist turn allowed him to win at a first class in the Greats in 1878. It is interesting to note that the sticking at the feet is one of the palliest friends of autism. So many instances, though, through history have bound to the stuff, though hawk-like luck would have it that in 1876 William Wilde died. Oz had a rummy time of it, and he barely noticed that his mater had only been left 7,000, enough to plant her in good keeping and just afloat towards the social norms. Oz paid off a few of the debts with his half, and towards the holes in Greco he had in 1877 with a Prof. Maffley from Dublin. He was also landed with a nice pile in the country, a cottage though. He got into scrapes with Oxford though for not stepping back to college in time from his holes. But his Dublin's connections were almost abandoned when his pater left the sphere. Also, losing her daughter, Marion, Lady Wilde was lost. Well, Wilde and relived to get out of a pad full of unhappy thoughts. The requisite in Oz's first poetry number was dedicated to his said sister, while his bro, Willie, became a journalist for the World paper in London. He helped Oz in making a smash in the literary world as much as he could. The crux of the situation was that Oz's efforts to conquer Oxford had taken up an enormous amount of his energy. His mission now happened to take London by storm, but in the truth of stuff, he had a devil of a time, just containing his opulence and pervasive lifestyle to the degree that it began to complement his character rather than degrade his visage. He might have been vain or weak, but definitely self-confident in his work, nightly reflected in his opinion of himself as a professor of aesthetics. He argued for what he saw as a disallowed state, blighty, very much like Charlie Dickey. Seeing it as disorganised and corrupt, as did Wilde, a true Asperger's sufferer? Perhaps. Oz found on this op that there had not been any intellectual progress within industry for decades. Art, culture, literary appreciation was all at the front ledge of progress, but Oz was never one to half-ass it. He always tried to strive for the best he could get. That this was something that cost him. He wanted to keep up his appearances, whatever the cost. And today was the only part of a rounder to be considered, despite the fact that his papers downsizing and his inheritance had been a stickler to his confidence. Oz took comfort in his brother's success, a sure thing when it comes to externally validifying your own self-esteem. Block it up with the success of others. Although he did start to try and cut down on the unnecessaries by 1880. He took up journalism, a shorn sign of desperation for a chap like Oz, and moved into an unfurnished gaff in Salisbury Street. He was still focusing on his poetry, though. A true artist doesn't give up the odds that easily. I should remember that one, really. They justify their passions with a slight consideration, then feel happy. His literary success eventually led to theatrical acclaim upon getting involved with theatre companies and writing for them. He got to know all the actors and actresses in his circle with jolly humour and scrappy enthusiasm. He was binding to create a corking circle. Patrons of the theatre, Lord Linton, Lady Shrewsbury, Lady Dorothy Neville, Lady de Grey, Mrs. Joanne, etc. It went on. He crunched so many contracts, though with all the socialising he began to lose creative focus. The juice was running down for all his charming witticisms. It was when he met Morris and Whistler that he began to shove the artist's boat even further. Encapsulated by modern art, Oz took the inspiration and put the picturesque, new phrases and caught a kind of poetry. All this influence came in from these two geezers. Unfortunately, Oz got even more self-righteously pompous under Whistler's tutelage. It is to be noted that there is a large proportion of the pop, especially autistic ones, who find themselves substituting external personalities to validify their own. However, it was boundless vanity that filled the void of self-worth, but it didn't do old window letters much good. He was speedily running out of readiness and continued to look defeat in the face by declaring that nothing succeeds like excess. He continued in this vein, even though it was costing him everything. But although seen as a staunch poser by many, Oz still maintained indifference to the middle-class trappings he saw all around him, despite the fact that he could have been eyeballed as one of them. The artistic movement of the pre-Raphaelites seemed to be increasingly attracted to his work and outlook. From that start, he seemed to attract the anarchist element, and prob was, of course, that Oz perfected the right outlook for a man with all his disabilities, one of positivity, but not the right attitude because of the peeps with which he was hanging. A corrupted external validity at its cheapest. Though despite his notoriety, through these new acquaintances, the scourge of Oz's life was his lolly problems. Having dodged the prob, half an egg, Oz continued to live well beyond his means, until eventually he had to touch the mater for a bob or two. And this is when it comes to the crux. This is when you really fall down to the very depths of despair, when you have to touch a mater for money. I mean, that is poor. He had to get his volume of poetry off the floor, he felt. He desperately thought himself a poet up to his puff. David Brogue eventually gave it the stamp in 1881. David Brogue, the publisher, and he was jumping with Oz was jumping with pride over it. It had 4 editions in a few weeks. The Oz could still not find a journalist's hat, so he made the punch that he would break into the lecturing circuit, and after being boosted by his publishing brother, he had a gig in America. Now, I've said many times before, novelists always try for America. Some succeed, but very few. Some get notoriety, but very soon go off the idea, because it's not conducive to the overall the expanding mindset of an author. Oz then decided to fly back to Blighty in 1883, now finding better success on the boards. He then went with his chum, Whistler, to Paris, where he chucked out the Duchess of Padua, a blank verse number, but contrary to Oz's hopes, it flattened, which when performed in New York in 1891, this exemplifies the whole needing to be spoon-fed. The industry in the US tended to propagate even today. But the boosting of one's ego to survive is always a sure ticket for the superego to fail. After he had tapped Paris for all its shackles, Oz returned once more to the old homestead country. Mayfair was his resting place, and he spent many an opulent party there, realising its class to such an extent that he set his famous anti-hero Grey there years later. But he had inspiration towards this, but it wasn't inspiration that had culminated or even juiced into anything substantial at that point. The main reason he took rooms there was to be close to his mother, who had tried to get him allied with the Irish national movement. Oz, as we know, was too much of an independent soul for any of the political wrangling. He hid his self-consciousness and began to lend itself to the incessant musings we pick at today. All of this made him very popular at dinner parties at the time. Grubbing up with the logistical, Oz was almost a must for the day in such circles. Oz was very much aware of his propensities toward the hedonistic behaviour, and it was at this point, in continuing his efforts to subdue this learning, to keep the wolf from the door financially, he had to bite the bullet and marry, knowing full well his preferences. Not a great idea. A sure sign of an introverted and schizoid personality, perhaps. Though, perhaps not. That is not to say it was a malicious intent. Such a condition could be seen in a myriad of fortunettes. But Miss Constance Lloyd was a woman of no particular birth or such standing that it had a good she did have a good £200 a year in her purse, which tided Oz over. Now living in Chelsea, the couple were bound by kids, and little happened for the next 2 years. It was 1884, and Oz was getting comfortable in the matrimonial shackles he had laid himself in.
Every experience is a failure, and marriage is certainly an experience.
He had grown opulent and of a stouter build, to be frank. He often during that farce said that there is no general rule of health. It is all personal and individual. I only demand the freedom which I willingly concede to others. Of course, this sort of rude attitude appealed to the blighters that were like Oz, because it pounded to the superiority of the gents of society. The problem with it was, of course, that such an outlook excluded everyone else. Huge popularity ensued, and Oz was rapidly becoming subsumed by his own myth. The myth of personality, the cult of personality, which I've covered before on many an occasion. The fact that all education within English SOSH was, if slow growth hauled him, up to no end. But despite all this, it was almost rancorless that the brain box to understand that Oz's fast-paced success was more likely than the fugal set within Oz's history, as was the main cause. Such a class of song that transpires from the Oxford boarding school, admiring and boasting Oz's morals to the nth. It was in 1887 that Oz accepted editorship of The Woman's World and turned to a sensible, smaller ration. He changed somewhat through the years and became slightly bolder, no doubt exercising a certain amount of what is polished today as masking his anxious tendencies and innermost inclinations. Being bold and decisive was an exercise in combating this. It was for a few years after this that he had abstained from the old pen wielding and started gabbing in public a good deal, and he began to see everything more of a revelatory fash, an inspiration that would hit his hat with a flash. It was no surprise then, as soon as he lost the editor gig, Oz took up his pen again with renewed vigour. He wrote new stuff, penned articles and reviews and stuff. It was all a good read. However, in 1889 he drafted a paper that was smashed by the peeps of that time. It justified his stance on his identity, and perhaps we could look at today as another inspiration of the message in media. Very much akin to the recent obscenity that diluted one of the most beloved fictional endeavours of the last 60 years. But enough said of that. I could detract forever on that one. It was 1889 when he came out in an article written for the Fortnightly Review, headlining the assertion that even Shakespeare was gay, highlighting his own insecurities within Sosh himself, something that had been suspected for some time. Having many objections to the article, Oz then scrapped the fixture, decimated by the assistant editor of the magazine. Thus, it was shifted over to the Blackwood magazine in response. But no one liked being preached at, even in his day. No one liked being preached at through the media, and no one liked being told what to think. Does this remind anything of anyone?
Well, the world might forget its past maladies. It's in the brain, and the brain alone, that the great sins of the world take place.
I mean, does this conjure up any images? Perhaps familiar? Either any of this, and it caused a gust of disparagement and disgust throughout the reading public and well beyond. Sosh clearly wasn't ready for the acceptance within their reading pleasure with such declarations, and neither are they today. Some might say rightly so. When relaxing of an evening with a whiskey and S, those slouching after a day's labour on their soft don't want to be slammed at with political messaging. They simply want to be entertained This is another state of play that hasn't changed. Recognising that to send a message, it has to be hidden beneath the veneer of a well-constructed story. Oz wrote several instalments of A Picture of Dorian Grey, which was published in Lipcott's magazine later that year. Recognising its controve, Oz wrote, "It is a poisonous, if you like, but you cannot deny that it is also perfect, and perfection is what we artists strive for." Now, some might say that I am rather bumptious in my blasting of Oz in this vid. If they do, then they might venture that perhaps they might not be listening properly, or else my small endeavours might do not accurately convey the full whack of what I'm saying. Oz could not be of account in this scenario that surrounded him in the stage. If only the general pub knew, back then or today, the extent to which segregated or ADSD for sufferers made to feel it encumbering upon them to shield their pain and strife. Consideration might be at the order of the day, but a sufferer is encumbered to plug on regardless and conform to the norm. They have to be spoon-fed information on the suffering to keep them from getting upset. This is subscribable to all of the marginalised communities. Ridiculous though it may be, the general sosh cannot be blamed in this. Such conformity is requited in the combat of existence, the very existence that keeps them going, and it is only by organically fracturing the mechanical facts according to disabilities and marginalised communities can we convey our strife. It becomes necessary to drip feed such feelings and make them be recognised within allegorical fiction and mediums if public consumption. Any other feed of such information is understandably disparaging and rejected in the perversion of the norm. Thus was born Dorian Grey. Oz described Grey as a tale born of leprous literature from the French descendants, a poisonous book. The atmosphere which is heavy with metheric odours of moral and spiritual putrefaction.
Welcome to my little Hellfire Club.
When the book was published in 1891, some of it was changed to configure play which was planned. For an entry, the epigram, "Nowadays people know the price of everything and the value of nothing." This was stated by Henry Wooden, one of my favourite characters in the novel, for example, and it was adapted for usage in Lady Windermere's Fan, a sign that he was always slightly uncertain of his assertions, though because of such stuff, Oz chucked out so much time that fine chap got into his habitual of spouting the works of some chums before exercising. Henry Wotton in Dorian was an excellent personification of Oz's own oratory propensities. Henry would have ushered the famous line, "American girls are as clever at concealing their parents as English women are concealing their past." When, in 1892, Dorian Grey hit the American press, this was much frowned upon. Oz had found his voice in Dorian. More than just an immortal man, he had given the world an immortal voice. Unfortunately, it is one that has never died down to the roadblock on which it has been purveyed today, or at least perverted today, into justification for the indoctrination of opinion rather than simply the expounding of it. Written as a simplification of Balzac's Peur de Chagrin, Oz had little patience to write a treatise on philosophy, and so produced a simple story page verse thingy that was deemed at the time as a penny dreadful. Such a young sprog to be delivering such words as well. But when Oz's trial took place in 1895, it was the turning point in his ostracisation. Despising his own defence, Oz even was charged with conspiracy.
There are no limits to the ugliness of old men.
There were these charges that they were later dropped. They even tried to pin him for a story in a magazine which he had not even written, although he had written for the mag, The Chameleon. The focus of the charges was the immorality of his writing, and it was his writing that had, above all, kept his sanity afloat for so many years. Much like a lot of torn decisions that were made today by autistic and marginalised individuals. For many, writing, fiction and romance of such outlets is all they have to keep them out of padded establishments. The perversion of sosh media and commercial fiction is a boundary to that end, and peeps through their goodwill and lounging to get into heaven that Oz so disparaged are destroying the stability of that disabled minority, systematically by establishments who simply want to be seen to be doing good as opposed to actually having such a desire.
You have no right to melancholy. Your life is exquisite. You've drunk deeply of everything and it hasn't left a fleck on you.
Either that or they are fundamentalists who seek to shift sosh media to their own ends through the best of intentions without actually thinking of the consequences. Through middle-class prejudices and ill-conceived goodwill, Wilde was criticised in the press for weeks during this farcical strand. It was indicative of the blight that we see about us in the 21st century. Oz's defence was that his sexuality was intellectually executed rather than spiritually based, or based around sexual desire. A prime example of the torn decisiveness that had reared its muggins in the latter part of his life. The doc eventually released Oz at £2,500 bail. He was assured by a Lord Doug of Howick and a Rev Stuart Headlam. It spoke vols for Oz rep that he was so admired. However, it was around or later that he was condemned on similar charges and sentenced to 2 years hard labour. That says it everything for British justice, doesn't it, really? He was never entirely content with familiar sosh after all this, and with the help of a good friend secured a launcher headed for Boulogne, France, where he spent the rest of his life in seclusion and depressive exclusion, dying a regretful exile, depressed and rejected by his own kin in 1900. The 30th of November reflected this position momentarily, as it was a dash cold. He sent for a minister during his last hours and succumbed to a belief system that he so cast aside in his wonder years. The belief system of Christianity. Though through all this was a slight of a man that set in a position by his own country that pushed and fractured understanding, tearing at the decisions that society had made around him. Give us a good clicking, guys.
Shakanaka.